Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. So I've had yet another request from one of my ever loyal fan base. So I always seek to serve those who subscribe to my channel. So gratis, I'm doing this. Someone wants to know about Protestant Catholic differences. Well, first of all, define the terms. That's what one should always do at the outset. So Catholics, by this I understand Roman Catholics, if one's going to be precise, as in those who have the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, that is, as the head of their church. Whereas Protestants were those who protested against the Catholic Church and split off the Catholic Church in the 16th century. So the Catholic Church obviously traced itself right back to Jesus Christ and claims its authority coming from him. You know, Jesus saying to St. Peter, "This is the rock upon which I built my church. Whatever you declare bound on earth is bound in heaven. Whatever you say is loosed on earth is loosed in heaven." And granting him the keys of the kingdom, which were there's the Vatican. Remember, the Catholic Church has got its own sovereign country, the Vatican City in Rome, and you can see its square flag, along with Switzerland, the only square flag in the world, half yellow, half white, and the white half, that's the right-hand half. If you, as you look at it, there's the papal tiara, a crown, and the cross keys, one silver, one gold, the keys to the kingdom of heaven. So that is that, and then the Pope being a political as well as a religious leader. The Protestants accept much of what the papacy was doing, right down till the 16th century, and they said that Roman Catholicism had lost its way. They were against authority from Rome. There was a nationalist and indeed xenophobic aspect of the Reformation, and they split off and founded various national churches, occasionally transnational churches, and that was that. But they didn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's a very spirited debate within Protestantism about what aspects of the Catholic tradition they can carry on with and what they think is morally suspect and it needs to be jettisoned. So that's that. Now, as I say, Protestantism emerged in the early 16th century, but there's some proto-Protestants, Christians who'd critiqued the Catholic Church down the centuries. They were talking about Western Christianity because, of course, 1054 was a split, the schism between Western and Eastern Christianity, when the Patriarch of the West in Rome, he claimed to have authority over the other four patriarchs, and they said, "No, you don't. We're all on an equal footing." He wouldn't accept that he was merely their peer. So they split, one patriarch for the West, four for the East, of Antioch. I can't remember, was it Jerusalem, Constantinople, and I can't remember whether it was Athens. Obviously, Jerusalem was eventually lost, so Moscow was created as a new one to replace that. That's why the Orthodox Church, or the Eastern Church, we sometimes call it. And there was little love lost between the Eastern and Western Church for a long time. So Protestantism is in the Western Christian tradition. And curiously, Protestants and Orthodox Christians often get on better than Orthodox Christians do with Roman Catholics, or Protestants did with Roman Catholics quite a lot of the time. I know Catholics, we usually don't call ourselves Roman Catholics. Read The Informer by Sean O'Callaghan, who was a mole inside the IRA, providing information to Ongora the Shakona and the Crown Forces, and hearing the Reverend Ian Paisley, a firebrand Protestant preacher, talk about Roman Catholics, and Sean O'Callaghan and his confrère in the IRA, Catholics to a man, took umbrage at that, saying, "We're not Italian, don't call us a Roman Catholic." But sometimes people say that to make it crystal clear, as opposed to, let's say, Greek Catholic. You think, oh, a Catholic of the Greek nationality. No, much more likely someone who practices, Orthodox Christianity under the authority of the Pope, if that makes any sense. So it's Orthodox style of worship, but the Pope is the head of the church, and that is the litmus test. Is the Bishop of the Rome the supreme religious leader of your church? Likewise, the Ukrainian Catholics, and their style of worship is Ukrainian, they're Eastern Rite in that sense. And these use the Ukrainian language, when the rest of us use Latin, but the Pope is the head honcho of their church. it all goes back to the the 18th century, I think, when the Holy Roman Empire, which included the western bit of Ukraine, for instance, when they said you're not allowed to be Orthodox Christians. Some of the Orthodox Christians, they nominally converted but continued the old style of worship. The Uni-Age Church, they say, was sometimes people say it's a blend of Catholicism and Orthodoxy. And people often so associate Eastern Europe with Orthodoxy that some people, when Karol Wojtyla became Pope John Paul II, some people in Western Europe didn't quite grasp that he could be a Catholic and didn't realise that 90% of Poles are Catholics, that Eastern Orthodoxy is a very minor thing in Poland. Okay, so that John Wycliffe could be regarded as a proto-Protestant, this 14th century Oxford Don who translated the Bible into English, and certainly since the 9th century AD there have been sections of the Bible translated into English, but he did the whole thing. And he was a thorn in the side of the clerical authorities in England and didn't like the way that bishops were lording it over the laity and living in the lap of luxury and not giving a damn about people who are living in severe need, and seemed to care far more about their own opulence than they did about serving the church. People went into it for the wrong reasons sometimes, out of vanity and all the rest of it, and avarice. So that was him. And of course the Catholic hierarchy was irate, but he had a potent protector in the shape of John of Gaunt, the uncle of the king. And John of Gaunt was especially puissant figure because his nephew had become king at the tender age of 11. And so Wycliffe died a straw death. He died peacefully in his bed. He was never put on trial for heresy. So that's why there's Wycliffe Hall in Oxford University, which is for, well, an Anglican permanent private hall, and some people there are studying theology or preparing for ordination in the Church of England. But there were lollards around at the same time. It comes from this Dutch word for mumblers. They were in the Netherlands and in the British Isles. Again, they were really precursors of the Reformation. So Martin Luther was a monk. I can't remember. I think it was an Augustan monk, and religiously obsessed, so God-bothering that he would confess his transgressions. And the confessor said, "We've done nothing iniquitous. For goodness sake, why don't you just go and then commit some sort of infraction and come back and confess your sin to me, your venal or mortal sin?" And he didn't. And he converted. Well, he became a monk because he'd been frightened in a storm and said, "Oh, Saint Anne, save me now! Become a monk." Became a monk, and he went on pilgrimage to Rome, and he was disabused of his notions of clerical piety, and he was absolutely aghast at the frank impropriety of so many of the clergy. There being brothels in Rome specifically to cater for the lusts of clergy who are supposed to be setting a moral example to the others, and so the hypocrisy was absolutely staggering. And then this created a bit of cognitive dissonance in him. How could the Roman Catholic Church be morally pure and his behaviour be often so sinful? Not saying that all monks, nuns, or priests were like this, but it was more than a few. And why should Germany be sending huge sums of money to Rome? So obviously, as usual happens in a religion, it's an insurgent force when it's founded, and it's co-opted by the establishment, becomes a conservative or even a reactionary force, and mainly about separating fools from their money. And many people were just gulled by this. The wealthy, the powerful, the erudite, they are the clerical authorities, and they're telling those who have little knowledge, are not self-assured, who are penniless, that they've got to cough up. And that's the way it goes. 'Twas ever thus. So Martin Luther, in I think it was All Souls' Eve, in 1517, he famously wrote his 95 Theses in Wittenberg, Germany. And notice he wrote them, he didn't nail them to the door of the university church. That's a 19th century German nationalist fallacy. And if you read them, they are exclusively concerned with this doctrine of indulgences. So the Catholic Church invented this notion of purgatory. If you died, if you're exceedingly good, you go direct to the higher regions, to the celestial regions. If you're very wicked, to the infernal ones. But mostly you float around in purgatory, being purified by pain, being purged of your wickedry through suffering. But you could speed up the journey of your dead relatives and friends by paying for them. So people are being licked by these lambent flames for millennia, and you are hoarding your old coins. Give them to the bishops and the archbishops, and you'll speed up our journey to the promised land. And so they were real estate agents for the New Jerusalem, the Catholic Church. And he said this is a hoax, is a cruel fraud on vulnerable, gullible people. Relations between him and Rome got worse and worse. And 1521, he finally broke with Rome. He'd been on trial. Here I am. I can do no other. He wouldn't cave in. So he translated the Bible into German, and that's why Standard German is so close to his own Saxon dialect. It did so much to advance the German language, and he wrote an address to the nobility of the German nation. The very fact that he felt that he could make such an address is telling, insofar as there was a German nation, rather than what is Germany was very imprecise. We often said the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, but not all Germanophones were part of the Holy Roman Empire. Many people in the Holy Roman Empire were not Germanophones, and on and on. Okay, but it later became more or less synonymous with the Habsburg dynasty and Austrian rule. Austria est in orbe ultima, or alles Erdreich ist Österreich untertan, the various other ones. Aquila allegit Jovis omnia vincit, and there are various other permutations of that. AEIOU. All right, so what are some of the core doctrines of Protestantism that, most Protestants would agree on? There would be sola scriptura, so elevating the Bible, so the centrality of the gospel and, the Bible in general. And also he said, let's not play mind games and be faffing around with exegesis and interpreting things and symbolically all the time. We should understand it in the plain and ordinary sense of the words, which led to too much literalism, too much idea of inerrancy. Even then, Protestants would accept that there is metaphorical language in the Bible saying when it says the trees clap their hands, they will accept that the trees didn't actually clap their hands. You have to read it as the right sort of literature and realize that is being poetic. But often they would stick to things absolutely rigidly when Catholics are more blasé about it. For example, the Catholic Church was actually quite early accepting evolution and was not terribly fussed about that, about us evolving over millions of years, where Protestants often find it very difficult to accept that. Justification through faith alone, that would be another important aspect of Protestantism, which it wouldn't share with Catholicism. And Catholicism is much more into ritual, Protestantism not so ritualistic. Protestantism was iconoclastic at the beginning, smashing religious imagery, whitewashing them, whereas Catholicism was iconographic, as in creating images and often believing that these statues and paintings and so on had magical powers and you could propitiate them, and it was sympathetic magic, could confer on you good fortune, you could be cured of some malady, or things would go your way. And veneration of the saints, not just the Blessed Virgin. So it was almost like polytheistic Catholicism. There was a whole marketplace of petty deities to be appeased. And if you did right by them, they would favour you and good fortune would be yours. Whereas he said this was Romish superstition. So that many of these saints have very little factual basis, very little documentary evidence for them. So we get rid of them. And so Protestant churches tend to be plainer, almost emptier, have less artwork. And that's why, say in the 16th century, certainly in the English language, our vocabulary becomes much more vivid, much more colourful, and about creating images in the mind, partly because we didn't have the stained glass so much. Not that I'm English, but there was a little bit of English spoken in Ireland at the time, and less imagery around. So people had to do it verbally. Music, the Catholic Church has got a magnificent musical tradition. Protestantism was iffy about the beginning. They got into it later on. But Protestantism is a very broad church. There's a spectrum from people who are, Anglo-Catholics, practice Catholicism within the Church of England. The Pope's not the head of their church, but in all other senses they are Catholic, right down to ultra-Protestants who think that Catholicism is the root of all evil, who say the Pope is the whore of Babylon, he's the Antichrist, and blah, blah, blah. And a very simplistic worship, some that wouldn't allow any musical instruments at all, no artwork whatsoever, be puritanical. Okay, so should you have bishops or not? Well, Protestants generally don't. The Catholic Church, we've got bishops, archbishops, we've got cardinals, there's the Pope at the top, is very hierarchical. We have priests. Before that we had lectors and deacons, and it's very systematic and very much about the chain of command. we're very much into ceremony and stylized worship and a litany and having the missal, the book. You have to read precisely the right words. Had to say it in Latin to make it universal. It was only in Vatican II in 1962, the Second Vatican Council said, okay, we can have it in vernacular languages. And we'd obviously been tardy about accepting the Bible in vernacular languages, even though, of course, none of the Bible was originally in Latin. It was originally in classical Hebrew, Aramaic, and ancient Greek, only subsequently translated into Latin. But the more translations are, the more mistakes are going to be. And if you get even one word wrong, that could be critical. So Protestant clergy would more likely be called minister, as in the Latin word for servant. They're servants of God, not a government minister. Pastor, as in the Latin word for shepherd, things like that, or parson. Now, the Church of England, they do have priests, but there are also some other title for priest could be a vicar or rector, depending on his status in the parish. I don't quite understand it myself. The Roman Catholic Church, there could be several priests in the parish, and the most senior one is often called Monsignor, known as Monsignor, as in my senior in Italian. Or sometimes they put PP, parish priest. He's the boss, and he's got a junior priest, or 2 or 3 junior priests, curates, we often call them. They're caring. Okay, so now in the Church of Scotland, they do say bishop, but that's something different. That's just someone supervising a new minister. So the whole idea of bishops is all about apostolic succession. So Jesus calls the 12 apostles. He supposedly ordains them. They're the first bishops. And they, in turn, ordained other bishops, who ordained other bishops, who ordained other bishops down the generations. So a bishop today, at his ordination as a bishop, he had his hands laid on by a bishop, who was ordained by a bishop, who was ordained by a bishop, all the way back to the 12 apostles, all the way back to Jesus Christ. That's apostolic succession. So the 12 disciples, or the 12 apostles, same thing. So it's very much top down, okay, and the Pope is at the throne of St. Peter. He's got his authority from Jesus Christ. That's the idea there. So when a Pope dies, the College of Cardinals meets, roughly 100 cardinals. They meet in Rome, and their conclaves, as in with the key, they're locked in. Obviously, food and drink given in. They can do laundry, but no communication. Till white smoke is seen. They burn the ballot papers. White smoke comes up, and the Cardinal Secretary of State comes out onto the balcony above St. Peter's Square and says, "Annuncia vobis gaudia mainem habemus papam." I announce to you great joy, we have a pope, and goes on to say the name. So whereas Protestantism is sometimes it's from the bottom up, not from the top down. The ordinary churchgoers, this would be Presbyterianism, elect elders, as in presbyteros in ancient Greek. An elder doesn't need to be particularly old, despite the name. And the elders, they elect people to go to the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church of that country once a year to sort out various matters. A moderator is elected there, and he or she serves for 1 year only. That's it. They have no bishops, no archbishops. And there are ministers in Presbyterian churches who have a special theological education. So the laity have control as much as the clergy. They're not a separate caste. Whereas in the Roman Catholic Church, you're either a layman or you're a clergyman. Okay, we don't say clergywoman, a lay woman as well. You could say as opposed to a nun. Monks and nuns are religious. That's a noun, not a verb in this case. They're not clergy, strictly speaking. Confusingly, someone can be a priest and a monk at the same time. They're like 2 professions, like being you could be a doctor and a dentist at the same time. Okay, so priests can officiate at rituals. That's the distinction. There's certain ceremonies which only count if performed by a priest, like marriage, or the Blessed Sacrament, the Eucharist, blessing the bread and the wine. So believing in transubstantiation, this becomes the body and blood of Christ. That's a key difference between Catholicism and Protestantism. Okay, it goes back to the Last Supper. Mass, the key Catholic ceremony, as in mess at the table, it is a reenactment of the Last Supper in some parts. He broke the bread and gave it to them, saying, "Take this, all of you, and eat this in memory of me. This is my body." Okay, hocus pocus. Remember the magic words from magicians? Hocus pocus. Hoc est corpus meam in Latin. This is my body. And so people were listening to the priest rattling off the litany for an hour, bored rigid because they couldn't understand a word of it. Most of these illiterate people couldn't read their own language, let alone comprehend Latin. And suddenly the priest would make them sit up, bolt upright. A bell would be tinkled because this was the sacred bit, and he'd be saying hoc est corpus meam. That was misheard as hocus pocus, but people know that hocus pocus means this is the magic words. And those are the crucial words which actually perform the miracle. So this communion bread, it looks like bread, it smells like bread, it tastes like bread. Under the microscope or any chemical test, it would be bread. But the miracle is it's actually the body of Christ. Likewise, the blood of Jesus, the wine, saying, this is my blood, it was shed for you in an everlasting covenant. So those, again, are the magic words, but only spoken by a priest, not by a layman like me. And that's when it happens. Now, some Protestants will say this is transsignification. We realize it's still bread and wine. So they'll have communion with the bread and wine just occasionally, but they won't. They don't believe it's a miracle. There are a few Anglo-Catholics who do believe in transubstantiation. So you could say, so that's it. So the lower church Protestants, as in Methodists, Presbyterians, further away from Catholicism, they do that rarely, call it the Lord's Table or the Lord's Supper, things like that. So anyway, the Roman Catholic Church believes in seven sacraments, as in baptism, First Communion, confirmation, I can't remember, holy orders, matrimony, extreme unction, confession, and often you could only do 6 of the 7 because you couldn't be both married and be in the clergy. But there are very rare exceptions to that. Obviously, clerical celibacy is a discipline, not a doctrine. It's only been around for a millennium, only 1,000 years. Could change, but there's no sign of it. And they have granted people dispensations in recent years who've come over from Catholicism. Or apparently some African priests were in societies where marrying was absolutely de rigueur and said that would be permitted. Monasticism is part of the Roman Catholic tradition, whereas not in the Protestant tradition. But in the 19th century, there's the Oxford movement in Oxford University. John Henry Newman, when he's writing his tracts, they're also called Tractarians, and bringing back some of the Catholic traditions. They were revived in the Church of England. But anyway, he went the whole hog. He crossed the Tiber, as the expression goes, and became a Roman Catholic, eventually became a cardinal. That's that. That's why he was beatified by the Pope, as in blessed, beata, blessing. The Beatitudes, blessed are the peacemakers, and all the rest of it. That's a staging post on the way to becoming a saint. Anyway, John Henry Newman, but he became a Roman Catholic. But there are Anglo-Catholics, people still in the Church of England, and the Queen is the head of their church, not the Pope. But apart from that, they practice Catholicism, and they brought back monks and nuns. They're Anglican monks and nuns, not very many. So outside the Church of England at the time of the British Empire, they spread all over the world. And so that's why they're called the Church of whatever that a country is. The Anglican Church of Australia, the Episcopalian Church of the United States, the Church of North India, the Church of South India, the Church of Pakistan, the Church of the Province of Central Africa. There's obviously several African countries put together, as in like Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and so on. So some of them got the word Anglican in the name, most do not. Episcopalian Church in the United States, because the Church of England was there till the Revolution. Then that ended. So they still wanted bishops. So they use episkopos, as in the Greek word for bishop. They're not presbyteros, as in elder. They're not Presbyterian. So how do you have bishops ordained new bishops? Well, the Church of England refused to do it, so the Church of Denmark did it, which was a Protestant church which had bishops. So that was that. There's some debate, is the Church of England Protestant at all? Some people say it's Reformed, it's not Protestant. So are you a Protestant? Ask an Anglican, as in a member of the Church of England. Some will say yes, some will say no. So there's the Anglican communion for churches from around the world, which really are branched off from the Church of England at the time of the British Empire. And there's the Anglican Church in Canada, or is it called Episcopalian Church? I can't remember. And all over. So every 10 years they meet at the Lambeth Palace Conference in London. Then they're in full communion with some churches, like, say, the Church of Denmark, the Church of Sweden. Some of these are Lutheran, as in the tradition of Dr. Martin Luther, really the founder of Protestantism. And there's a Lusitanian Episcopalian Church, as in Portugal, Lusitania being the name for Portugal, and on and on. There might be some countries with no church as part of the Anglican Communion. So that's that. These are some of the distinctions between Protestantism and Catholicism. Catholicism has got a more lavish artistic tradition, is more expensive, and Protestantism is more simplistic, is meant to be more focused on the Bible, and that's it. So the Catholic Church produces catechism. It was very organized, systematized, centralized. They believe big was beautiful. and Protestantism, well, would allow very different versions of Protestantism, as in Congregationalist, Plymouth Brethren, Seventh-day Adventist. The house churches, just people meeting very informally, worshipping in their house. The Quakers, sometimes called the Religious Society of Friends. The only ones I haven't mentioned. Congregationalists were often a blend of Presbyterians and others. Baptists, Anabaptists, Wesleyans and Methodists, because John Wesley founded the Methodists. Some Wesleyans are Methodists and some Methodists are Wesleyans. I don't quite get it myself. Reformed Presbyterians, Evangelical Presbyterians, non-subscribing Presbyterians, Unitarians. Non-subscribing Presbyterians wouldn't subscribe to the Westminster Confession of Faith, and the Unitarians believe in the unity of God, not in the Trinity. Not that there's the God the Father, there's the Son, and there's the Holy Spirit. Say, God is one. Didn't quite get it. How can this make sense? 3 is 1, 1 is 3. What? Well, it's like water. Water exists in 3 states. It can be aqueous, gaseous, or solid, but it's still water. Or that's how it is. St. Patrick used the shamrock to describe God, the Trinity. You can rip off one leaf, the other 2 die. You've got to have the 3 together. It doesn't work. But they didn't talk about Jesus until, about 1 AD. Was he always there? All right, that is scratching the surface of this gigantic topic.